The mountains have a way of swallowing the things we love and spitting back the remains in places they should never be found. You walk into the timber thinking the trees are just wood and the shadows are just a lack of light, but you are wrong. There is a weight to the silence in the high country of Colorado that feels less like peace and more like a predator holding its breath. It was October 2nd in the year 1999 when the Big South Trail decided it was hungry. The air was crisp and smelled of dying pine needles and the sharp metallic tang of the coming winter. A group of 11 people set out that morning, including a man named Jaryd Atadero and his 3-year-old son Jaryd. They were part of a Christian singles group looking for a peaceful hike, but the wilderness does not care about your faith or your intentions. Jaryd was a boy full of that reckless energy that only 3-year-olds possess, wearing a bright red pullover sweatshirt that should have made him impossible to lose. He was small but sturdy, with a bowl cut of brown hair and a smile that had not yet learned to fear the world. The trail they followed wound along the Cache La Poudre River, where the water churns over slick granite boulders like grey mussels flexing under the surface. It is a beautiful place, if you do not look too closely at the gaps between the trees where the darkness lingers, even at noon. The group was spread out as hikers often are, with the faster walkers pushing ahead and the slower ones lingering to take in the scenery. Jaryd was darting back and forth between the adults like a needle threading a loom. The boy ran ahead of his father to catch up with 2 other members of the group who were further up the trail. He wanted to see the fishermen they had spotted earlier near the riverbank. It was a distance of maybe 50 yards, a stretch of dirt and rock that should have been safe. Alan watched his son move through the flickering light of the aspens until the boy rounded a bend and vanished from sight. It was a gap of less than 3 minutes. When the father reached the spot where he expected to see his son talking to the hikers ahead, he found only the sound of the wind. The hikers Jaryd was chasing said they never saw him. The fishermen by the water said no child had passed them. The silence that followed was not the natural quiet of the woods, but something heavy and suffocating. Alan began to call his son's name, his voice bouncing off the canyon walls and returning to him unanswered. Within hours, the Big South Trail was crawling with search and rescue teams and bloodhounds and helicopters with thermal imaging cameras. They looked in the river thinking the boy might have fallen in, but the current was not strong enough to carry a body away without leaving a trace. They searched the thickets of willow and the jagged rock slides where a child might hide or huddle for warmth. The dogs picked up a scent that led to a specific spot on the trail, and then they simply stopped, as if the trail of the boy had ascended directly into the clouds. For 8 days they combed the wilderness with over 50 searchers and specialized teams, but Jaryd Atadero was gone. There were no tracks, no torn fabric from his red sweatshirt, and no signs of a struggle. It was as if the earth had opened its mouth and swallowed him whole before sealing shut again without leaving a scar. The search was eventually called off, and Alan was left with a hole in his life that no amount of prayer or logic could fill. He spent years haunting those trails and talking to the media and begging for answers from a landscape that remained stubbornly mute. He knew his son had not just wandered off because 3-year-olds do not simply vanish into thin air in the span of 3 minutes. The story grew cold like the Colorado winters until June of the year 2003, when 2 hikers decided to go off trail. They were not looking for a lost boy, but for a challenge, as they climbed a steep and treacherous slope over 550 feet above the trail where Jaryd was last seen. This was not a place a toddler could reach on his own. The incline was nearly vertical, in places guarded by jagged outcrops of granite and thick tangles of mountain mahogany. It was on a narrow ledge overlooking the valley that they found something that made their blood turn to ice. A pair of small blue pants lay on the ground, and nearby was a tiny red sweatshirt. When the investigators arrived, they found the scene to be a physical impossibility. The clothes were not scattered as they would be if an animal had dragged a body up the mountain. The sweatshirt was inside out, but it was in remarkably good condition despite being exposed to the elements for nearly 4 years. There was no blood on the fabric, and no holes that would indicate the teeth or claws of a mountain lion or a bear. The most chilling detail was the shoes. Jaryd had been wearing sturdy little sneakers, and they were found sitting side by side on the ledge, as if the boy had carefully stepped out of them before vanishing again. One small tooth and a fragment of a skull were all that remained of the child himself. Think about the physics of that location for a moment. To reach that ledge, a 3-year-old would have had to cross a freezing river and then scale a vertical cliff face that would challenge a professional climber. He would have had to do this without tearing his clothes or scuffing his shoes to the point of ruin. And then he would have had to sit down and remove his clothing in a specific orderly fashion while the mountain air turned his skin to blue. It makes no sense in the world we understand. It suggests a force that can move through the woods without making a sound and transport a heavy weight to a high place without leaving a footprint in the dirt. There is a theory that some things in the deep woods operate on a frequency we cannot hear. They move in the spaces between our heartbeats, and they see us as nothing more than biological curiosities to be plucked from the vine. When you look at the condition of Jaryd's clothing, you see a pattern that repeats in hundreds of these cases. The victims are found in high places or deep marshes that are inaccessible to them. Their clothes are often found in a neat pile or turned inside out as if they were being examined by something that did not quite understand how human garments work. It is a clinical sort of abduction, a removal of a person from the timeline of the living. I have spent a long time looking at these maps and the clusters of disappearances that dot the national parks like a rash. The Big South Trail is a jagged line in a region known for strange magnetic anomalies and weather that changes in a heartbeat. Searchers often report a feeling of being watched by something that is not an animal. They talk about a sudden onset of fog that feels oily against the skin, or a silence so profound that it makes their ears ring. It is in those moments of sensory deprivation that people go missing. They step behind a tree or round a corner, and they simply cease to exist in our reality until they are returned years later as a collection of bones on a ledge. The official report will tell you that a mountain lion likely took Jaryd, but mountain lions are messy eaters. They drag their prey into thickets, and they leave behind a trail of blood and broken branches. They do not carefully remove a child's sweatshirt and turn it inside out. They do not leave shoes sitting neatly in the dirt 500 feet above the valley floor. If a predator took him, it was a predator that knows how to hide from thermal imaging and how to bypass the nose of a bloodhound. It was something that exists in the periphery of our vision, a shadow that has been hunting these mountains since before we had names for them. Jaryd Atadero still carries the weight of that day in the year 1999. He has lived through the nightmare of losing a child and the secondary trauma of finding out that the end was even more mysterious than the beginning. He looks at the mountains now, and he does not see majesty, but a wall of stone that keeps its secrets buried deep in the granite. We like to think we are at the top of the food chain, but when you stand in the shadow of Comanche Peak, you realize how small you really are. You are just a flicker of heat in a cold world, and there are things out there that know exactly how to snuff you out. The case of Jaryd Atadero remains a jagged pill to swallow because it offers no closure and no logical explanation. It forces us to confront the idea that there are predators in the wilderness that do not follow the rules of biology. They are the architects of the missing, and they leave behind these grisly puzzles to remind us that we are only visitors in their domain. When you go into the woods, you should remember that the trees do not have eyes, but they seem to see everything. You should remember that the wind does not have a voice, but it can carry your screams away until they are nothing but a whisper in the pines. The pattern is there, if you are willing to look. It is a pattern of high elevations and missing clothing and dogs that refuse to track. It is a pattern of children vanishing in the blink of an eye and being found in places that defy the laws of gravity. Jaryd was not the first, and he will certainly not be the last. The mountains are patient, and they have an infinite capacity for hunger. Every time a hiker steps off the trail or a child runs ahead of the group, the forest holds its breath and waits for the moment when the gap opens up. We are left with the image of those small red clothes sitting on a ledge high above the Poudre River. They are a monument to a mystery that has no answer. They are a warning to anyone who thinks they can master the wilderness with a map and a pair of boots. The wilderness is not a park, and it is not a playground. It is an ancient and indifferent entity that occasionally decides to take a piece of us back into the dark. Stay on the trail and keep your loved ones close, because the shadows in the high country are longer than they appear. This disappearance mirrors the haunting case of Casey Hathaway, who vanished from his grandmother's yard in North Carolina in the year 2019. The 3-year-old boy survived 2 nights in freezing temperatures and heavy rain, only to be found in a briar patch that searchers had already cleared multiple times. Casey later claimed he had been looked after by a bear that stayed with him the entire time he was missing. Like Jaryd, he was found in an area that should have been impossible for a toddler to navigate in those conditions. These stories suggest a strange, protective, or predatory force that interacts with the most vulnerable among us in ways we cannot comprehend. The air in the Roosevelt National Forest does not just sit around you, it presses against your skin with the weight of 1,000 years of silence. When you stand at the trailhead of the Big South Trail, you are looking into a green maw that has swallowed better men than you without so much as a burp. It is a place of jagged granite and deceptive shadows where the wind likes to play tricks with the direction of a human voice. In October of 1999, a 3-year-old boy named Jaryd Atadero stepped into that silence, and the world simply closed up behind him. He was there 1 second, a burst of energy in a red fleece jacket, and then he was gone, as if he had been erased from the frame of a film. The search that followed was a masterclass in human desperation and the cold indifference of the earth. Hundreds of volunteers and professionals combed the slopes of the Poudre Canyon, their boots churning the pine needles into a dark mulch while helicopters beat the air into a frenzy overhead. They used thermal imaging and bloodhounds and every scrap of technology that the turn of the millennium could offer, but the mountain refused to yield a single clue. The dogs would hit a wall of invisible static and sit down, their ears pinned back in a gesture of primal unease. It was as if the boy had not walked away but had been lifted vertically into the thin blue air, leaving no scent trail for the predators or the protectors to follow. 4 years later, the mountain decided to return a few fragments of the puzzle, but the pieces did not fit any reality we care to inhabit. 2 hikers found Jaryd's clothing on a steep ledge 550 feet above the trail where he was last seen. The red fleece jacket and the tiny pants were not scattered by the wind or torn by the teeth of a mountain lion. They were sitting there in a way that felt deliberate and mocking, as if they had been placed by a hand that understood the exact frequency of human grief. There were no remains except for a single tooth and a fragment of a skull, which only added to the sickening geometry of the scene. When you analyze the physics of a 3-year-old climbing 550 feet of near-vertical terrain through dense brush and jagged rock, the math simply fails. A child of that age does not have the motor skills or the physical stamina to navigate such a climb, especially not in the time frame allowed by the initial disappearance. It is a verticality that defies the laws of biology and suggests a transport mechanism that we are not allowed to see. We are taught to look for tracks and broken branches, but we never think to look up into the canopy where the shadows are thickest. We assume the predator is a cat or a bear because we need the threat to have a name and a heartbeat. But the clothes tell a different story because they were found in a condition that suggests they were removed rather than ripped away. A mountain lion does not undress its prey and leave the garments in a neat pile on a granite shelf. There is a clinical coldness to the recovery of these items that points towards something much more sophisticated and much more terrifying. It is a pattern we see repeated in the high country, where the clothing of the missing is found miles away from the point of disappearance, often turned inside out or stacked with a precision that defies the chaos of the wild. It is as if the architects of these disappearances are performing a sort of cosmic inventory. The case of Jaryd Atadero remains a jagged pill to swallow because it offers no closure and no logical explanation. It forces us to confront the idea that there are predators in the wilderness that do not follow the rules of biology. They are the architects of the missing, and they leave behind these grisly puzzles to remind us that we are only visitors in their domain. When you go into the woods, you should remember that the trees do not have eyes, but they seem to see everything. You should remember that the wind does not have a voice, but it can carry your screams away until they are nothing but a whisper in the pines. The pattern is there if you are willing to look at the data with a cynical eye and a steady hand. It is a pattern of high elevations and missing clothing and dogs that refuse to track the scent of the lost. It is a pattern of children vanishing in the blink of an eye and being found in places that defy the laws of gravity and the limits of human endurance. Jaryd was not the first, and he will certainly not be the last, because the mountains are patient and they have an infinite capacity for hunger. Every time a hiker steps off the trail or a child runs ahead of the group, the forest holds its breath and waits for the moment when the gap opens up. We are left with the image of those small red clothes sitting on a ledge high above the Poudre River as a monument to a mystery that has no answer. They are a warning to anyone who thinks they can master the wilderness with a map and a pair of boots and a sense of entitlement. The wilderness is not a park, and it is not a playground, but an ancient and indifferent entity that occasionally decides to take a piece of us back into the dark. Stay on the trail and keep your loved ones close, because the shadows in the high country are longer than they appear, and they are always reaching for something. This disappearance mirrors the haunting case of Casey Hathaway, who vanished from his grandmother's yard in North Carolina in the year 2019. The 3-year-old boy survived 2 nights in freezing temperatures and heavy rain, only to be found in a briar patch that searchers had already cleared multiple times. When he was finally recovered, he was in remarkably good condition despite the hypothermic environment that should have claimed his life within hours. Casey later claimed he had been looked after by a bear that stayed with him the entire time he was missing and kept him warm in the dark. Like Jaryd, he was found in an area that should have been impossible for a toddler to navigate in those lethal conditions. The similarities do not end there, because we must also look at the disappearance of Keith Parkins in the year 1952. 2-year-old Keith vanished from his grandfather's ranch in Ritter, Oregon, and was found 19 hours later, a staggering 12 miles away. To reach that location, the toddler would have had to cross 2 mountain ranges and navigate fences and creeks in total darkness. These stories suggest a strange, protective, or predatory force that interacts with the most vulnerable among us in ways we cannot comprehend. Whether it is a bear that talks, or a shadow that lifts you to a ledge, the result is the same, a total subversion of the physical world as we know it. There is a frequency in the deep woods that we are not tuned to receive, but the children seem to hear it clearly. They wander off toward a sound or a shimmering in the air that the adult mind filters out as background noise or a trick of the light. By the time we realize they are gone, the window has already closed and they are being carried into a geography that does not appear on any topographical map. We find their shoes and we find their jackets and we find their stories of bears and monsters, but we never find the truth. The truth is buried under layers of granite and pine needles, waiting for the next time the mountain feels a flicker of hunger. The case of Jaryd Atadero is a reminder that the veil between our world and something much older is paper-thin in the high country. We walk through the woods thinking we are the apex predator because we have fire and steel and satellite phones, but we are just heat signatures in a cold landscape. The things that live in the shadows of Comanche Peak do not care about our technology or our search parties. They operate on a timeline of eons, and they move through the brush without making a single sound. When they decide to reach out and take a child, they do it with a precision that makes our best investigators look like children playing in the dirt. The silence of the Poudre Canyon is not an absence of sound, but a presence of something that is listening to your heartbeat. It is a heavy, suffocating stillness that settles in your lungs and makes you want to look over your shoulder even when there is nothing there. Jaryd Atadero is still out there in the collective memory of the mountain, a ghost in a red fleece jacket that serves as a boundary marker for the unknown. We can tell ourselves stories about mountain lions and exposure to make the world feel safe again, but the clothes on the ledge will always be there to prove us wrong. The wilderness is watching, and it is always hungry for the things we hold most dear. In the year 1946, an 8-year-old boy named Catherine Van Alst disappeared from the Devil's Den State Park in Arkansas and was found 6 days later standing on a rock. She had traveled miles through rugged terrain and was found in a state of strange calm, as if she had been somewhere else entirely. Like Casey Hathaway and Jaryd Atadero, the logistics of her movement defied the physical capabilities of a child in that environment. These cases form a tapestry of the impossible that stretches across the decades and across the continent. We are dealing with a phenomenon that is consistent and patient and entirely indifferent to human suffering. We end where we began, in the shadow of the peaks, where the air is thin and the secrets are thick. The mystery of Jaryd Atadero is a wound that will never heal because it challenges everything we think we know about the natural world. It tells us that we are not alone in the woods and that the things out there are not always animal in nature. They are the architects of the missing, and they are waiting for the next hiker to step off the trail into the long shadows. Keep your eyes on the tree line and never let go of the hand of your child, because the mountain is always looking for a reason to close the gap. The final word on these cases is never truly spoken because the evidence is always incomplete and the witnesses are always too young or too dead to tell the full story. We are left to speculate in the dark while the wind howls through the canyons and the stars look down with cold, unblinking eyes. The pattern is the only map we have, but it leads to a destination that no one wants to visit. Jaryd Atadero, Casey Hathaway, and Keith Parkins are names etched into the bark of the world, and they serve as a warning to us all. The wilderness does not forgive, and it never forgets a scent once it has been caught in the breeze. If you find yourself in the high country and the birds suddenly stop singing and the air turns cold and heavy, do not wait for a reason to run. The silence is the sound of the predator closing in, and the shadows are the hands that are reaching out to pull you into the dark. We are only visitors in this ancient domain, and the rent is sometimes higher than we can afford to pay. The mountains will stay where they are long after we are gone, but they will always remember the taste of the ones who wandered too far. Stay on the trail, stay in the light, and never trust the silence of the pines.